It is part two. You are back. Welcome back.
Thank you for having me again. Here we are. We couldn't leave it where we left it. We had to do this.
Do you know what? There is so many things that we could dive into today that it's going to be never ending, because I think this is kind of a never ending topic.
Yeah,
And
there's so much, and because we don't talk about it, there's so much we need to talk about. So yeah,
and that's so true. There's so much that we need to talk about because we don't talk about it. And I think you're right. When we last spoke, these words ring true in my ears. You said disability and sex is the last big taboo. And here we are. We're breaking the taboo. We're going to have a whole conversation all about it. And I can't wait. I'm so excited.
yeah, it's. I just feel because we don't see it in the media, we don't hear about it in like sex education at schools. Really, like in mainstream schools, they wouldn't dream of talking about sex and disability because unless maybe if there's a disabled pupil. But even then, anyone I've spoke to in that situation, the like tutors, for example, will not talk about disability and sex.
Which, when you think about it, is absolutely ludicrous, because 1 in 4 people in the UK are disabled, which totals to something like 16 million people in the entirety
Yeah.
of the UK. So, like, I can assure you, those 16 million people are having sex. Like, facts.
Yeah, but you were more likely to see something on the TV about swingers, for example, or naturists, which is probably a lot less, obviously a lot less of the population, but it's kind of sensationalized, or we can put that on the telly, but or let's not talk about sex and disability because that should be behind closed doors.
Okay, so I do have a question for you. If you were to go into a school, and you were talking about disability and sex, what is like two of the main things that you would point out in a conversation?
I think the first thing would be that we all deserve pleasure,
Yeah.
no matter on your disability or how you feel like around your gender or anything like that. We all deserve pleasure.
Yeah.
And the second one would be to go out there and learn and just enjoy your body and love yourself first, and then tell people how to love you.
I think that's a really interesting point, isn't it? And it's something that we're definitely not taught at all, is that you need to be able to learn how to love yourself so you can teach someone else how to love you. Because I think we've grown up in this whole Disney era where the idea is that someone will come into your life and they'll know exactly and immediately how to love you or how to please you or how to have the best sex ever with this person. But actually that's not the reality, because none of us are mind readers.
No, and we need to get away from obviously most people. I would say that high percentage of teenagers now obviously learn from porn,
Yeah.
and that again is a negative. What they see in porn isn't a reality most of the time. So again, talking about what real life sex looks like, and there is platforms out there that show that, and I think it's endorsing them as well.
Mm-hmm. This is okay. So this is so interesting, because this isn't something that I knew until we spoke like last time. Is that there are platforms out there which showcase, I want to say like real life sex, but that's obviously like not really what I mean. But it's not this like theatrical movie production, which we now know as porn. So like in the UK and probably all around the world, I don't know statistics particularly around this because this is definitely not my area of expertise. But when we're talking about porn, we know that it is fake, and we know that there is a theatre production behind it. We know that there's lighting involved. We know that there's like, body doubles involved. We know that there's all of these different things that go into making this scene that isn't real. And yet this is how, as you said, the vast majority of young people are learning about sex and what it looks like and what it sounds like and what you should be doing and where you should be putting your hands, and all of this kind of stuff is all through these theatrical productions. But talk to me some more about these sites that don't involve the theatre as such. of porn.
Yeah, one of my favorites is Make Love Not Porn,
Mm.
which is owned by Cindy Gallop, and it's couples can submit videos of their like real world sex, which is what Cindy calls it, and it's videos that are very raw. They're all vetted and things like that, but they're very raw, and you see the sweating, you see the like cameras falling off the walls, the noises are natural. Um, when things go wrong, you see it, and I think that's what we've always got to portray as well. Sex isn't always perfect, as I alluded in part one about me dislocating my joints. If that was seen on film, yes, it would probably be a meme, clickbait, because oh look, this has gone wrong. Again, it's natural, it's normal. These things happen for years. You go back to porn and like adult mags in the 90s, and everything was like photoshopped and airbrushed, and that's gone on so much. But we're now seeing it again, obviously, with filters
Yeah.
on social media. So people to have a real false narrative of what is real. And that's what we need to get back to.
And what's really interesting is the point that's been brought up before is that disability and sex is not seen as something that just happens because of the porn industry. It can be seen as a kink or a fetish. And I'd love to delve into this idea a bit more with you, that actually all that we have seen in terms of disability and sex has been through that lens. Because actually, I don't remember the last time I saw a disability sex scene in like a TV show or in a movie or in, any mainstream media that isn't actually in some way making disability and porn and sex kind of entertainment and not in the best way.
Yeah, there certainly was. I can't remember ever seeing anything growing up like that.
Yeah.
I think over the last couple of years, you've had obviously sex education have tackled it, but there's nothing. But would you still class them as mainstream? I would say sex education would be definitely mainstream because had such a big
Yeah.
following on Netflix. But until you see something on like a 9 o'clock show on BBC One, for example, I don't know how mainstream it still is.
Yeah.
Channel 4, for example, when they do like Naked Attraction, there has been people with disabilities on there,
Mm-hmm.
but I don't know if you always say it's in a positive light though either.
Yeah, no, and
We
I and
we
I would agree
need,
with you on that.
yeah. Sometimes I just feel it's done for want of a word tokenism, or to like for a bit of sensationalism. Oh look, there's someone with a limb missing, for example.
Yeah.
We shouldn't be like that. Why? The media's got such a bad way of still talking about it, especially like certain newspapers and things like that will twist it into a negative way instead of looking at the positive and how if you've got a group of say like 16-year-olds who have got disabilities, if they don't see positive role models and especially around sex and body image, they're always going to be fighting against themselves, and that's what shouldn't be happening.
It's really interesting that you bring up Naked Attraction because I cannot think of anything worse. Going onto a TV show and just being like, and just being picked. Like I work out as well, so like my body's in really good shape, and I'm not being big-headed by saying that. It would be alarming if my body wasn't in good shape, the amount that I work out. But the idea that I would go and like bare all on a TV show for someone to pick me based on that is petrifying. And that's not because I'm not body confident, but that's because particularly like that type of TV show, I haven't really seen myself represented. So I would be the odd one out, and I would be the one that the discussion would be around, because you don't get to see the face until the end, do you? It's very much like
Yeah,
it's bit by bit by bit. So I think I can understand why it's almost sensationalized, because you're like, oh, like you didn't expect that to be there. But it's that lack of expectation that's the problem.
yeah.
Because where do we go from there?
It's really hard, especially with programs like that. I don't see a simple solution around it.
Yeah.
But this is where I will go back to one of the things when I talk to people about body positivity is we need to learn what what is real and what isn't, and then then like you say, you look at yourself and think, well, I'm normal. Even if you've got something physically wrong with you, and some people might think, oh, don't like that or whatever. That's their issue, not yours. So
Yeah.
again, like I say, it's loving yourself first. Um, and then if people can't accept you for what you are, they just need to fuck up. End of the day.
But it is so true. It's very, very true. And I love the fact that we're able to have this honest and open conversation about it, because there are so many pitfalls that the media have created, particularly for disabled people, particularly surrounding body image and sex and everything else that comes along with that, because we weren't represented. So therefore we didn't see ourselves. So therefore we weren't allowed to appreciate ourselves when we did look good, because we still didn't look as good as, quote unquote, the non-disabled, because that was what we looked up to. That was our role models. Like we didn't have the disabled versions of our role models. They didn't exist. And now with social media, they do. You know, you can go on Instagram and you can search, or you can go on Facebook, or you can go on YouTube. You can find those people who look like you. But it's still very interesting in terms of how we approach conversations around disability and sex. Because as I said, we've spoken about how we've only really ever seen it as a kink or a fetish. And I'm going to get you to explain the difference between the two, because I didn't know the difference between the two until about 10 minutes ago when we first started having this conversation.
So a kink is something that you can bring into your sex, so like BDSM, tickling, something like that. But the difference between that and a fetish is something you need in there for like pleasure. So if you have a kink about tickling, you might just bring it in now and again. If you have a fetish, you want it all, like to achieve the best pleasure you can have. You will want that in your sex life. Um, where disability is concerned, obviously there's so much around devotees.
Yeah.
Um, and obviously the only porn really that you kind of see around disability is fetishized.
Mm-hmm.
So there will be people who have it as a kink. There definitely will be. Um, and I think what we need to do is kind of not shame them for it,
Yeah.
but talk about it. Because there will be people who are quite happy to be fetishized or be part of someone's kink. There will always be someone out there.
Yeah.
So we've got to kind of have conversations about the boundaries where that goes as well.
Like all of this information, I'm literally taking this in and I'm like, wow. So kinks and fetishes are different. That's what I've taken from this.
Yeah.
But the idea that a disability can be a kink or a fetish, now, is that a good thing or is it a bad thing? And like, I don't want to say a bad thing, because I feel like bad is the wrong word to use, because it's not bad, it's just different. But how do we approach it in a way that doesn't make disabled people feel like they're just being used for their disability?
It's a really difficult one, is this? And I think it's just having open conversations
Uh-huh.
and not shaming someone. I think it's on the person who has the kink or the fetish to be open about it from an early, like, and say, oh, I really like you because you've got a limb missing, for example, and oh, that really does something for me, right? But I think it's better doing that than getting like into a relationship, say 12 months down the line, say, oh, do you know what? I really like that, and that's why I'd like asked you out. It's finding that happy medium, because there's definitely people in that situation.
Yeah, and that is. And we think about devotees. Now, this is going to be something that I really want to delve into, because I think a lot of people haven't really got a clue what a devotee is, and the like how problematic devotees can be. So I think if we start there and see where we like end up with this one, because as I said in our last chat, the amount of devotees that I've had on my account is alarming. And
Yeah.
and I know a lot of other women feel very, very harassed online with the devotees, because from my understanding of it is that a devotee is someone who is sexually aroused, turned on, does something for them surrounding the disability that you may or may not have. However, it's not necessarily about the fact that you're disabled. It's about the fact that they would have power over you because you're disabled, and you wouldn't be able to necessarily get out of said situation.
Yeah, it's I think it's definitely different to having a kink about a physical disability, for example. It's like that, having that conversation about, people have a type, or they're like blondes or like redheads and things like that. And kind of, is there something there, or someone likes disabled people, but like you said, with a devotee, I think it's that bit of control as well. That's where the issue comes in.
Yeah.
And it's that wanting to, verging on like a savior complex. I think it's getting that I want to be in control, I want to be their carer, and all that comes with it, and kind of take pride in that. So I think there is definitely an issue with that.
It's such an interesting one, because, and I wonder if it's different between me and you, because you are a male. So I wonder, do you still get devotees, or how is your space? And when I say your space, I mean like your social media. How is that? I was about to say, how is that penetrated by devotees, but that's like the wrong sentence to put together.
Do you know,
How do they show up?
I've had this conversation, and like I kind of, how I say it might sometimes come across wrong, and it's just, I find it really weird because I speak to so many sex educators and people in the disabled community, and the amount of people like yourself will say getting dick pics and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
As a male in the space, I've never had anything like that. And I kind of like, I joked to someone one day, and this is where I said, the day I get a tit pic, I know I've made it as a sex educator, but it was a joke in set. And I just find it weird that as a male, nothing like that ever happens. And I don't know if that's because I'm a straight male. I really don't, but I've never had, and I'm saying I don't think I've had someone like a devotee approach me, anything like that.
Honestly, like that blows my mind, because and the reason I say that is because when I first started talking about disability online, one thing that held me back was devotees, because it really, and I'm going to say it petrified me, the idea, and I don't really get scared by many things, but the idea that someone would only follow me or like look at what I was saying purely because they thought at some point they would have some form of sexual control over me because I was a disabled woman. Now, I think there's a whole thing to be said in that of fear around sexual control, because I think every woman's biggest fear is being assaulted, and that's like factual. I don't know a woman who doesn't have that fear. So for you to say that you've never really experienced anyone come onto your account and be like, here's my penis, is genuinely mind-blowing for me. And I think particularly around disability, because I don't know a disabled woman who hasn't been harassed in some form sexually online. And that says so much, because I know a lot of disabled women. We know a lot of the same people. Every single one of those women that we both know has been sexually harassed online at some point.
Yeah. And like I said, as a male in the space, never. And like, I do find it kind of weird in a way, because I don't know if that shows what is wrong with society, that it is mainly men that are the problem.
Yeah.
With sending images and things like that. I just, one day it might happen, and I will openly, the day it happens, I will talk about it and share it or whatever. But it's just, it is very strange. I don't know. The only thing I can kind of say that, especially since I've been in my wheelchair, I've noticed is I do get the odd person who kind of wants to mother me more.
Okay, right.
But that's different. I think that's just like, oh, are you all right, blah, blah, and checking up on me more. But I've sexual point of view, nothing. And I talk about sex all the time. So you would think I would kind of open myself to it. I don't,
Mm.
that is all I do is I talk about sex and disability and sex toys and things like that. So I'm in that space that kind of lends yourself to it. But
Yeah. I actually can't wrap my head around that. I genuinely can't, because I think because it's something that I'm so hyper aware of, and particularly with the limb different people that I know, there's a real big limb devotee problem on Instagram, and
yeah,
no matter how many times you report it, nothing happens. And because I don't use a wheelchair, I don't know what it's like. It's like a wheelchair devotee experience. I don't know what that experience is like, but the girls that I know on Instagram, and I say girls because, like you said, guys don't really tend to get this. And if they do, like, please feel free to send me a message. But the girls that I know, we all tend to like message each other with the snapshot of the account being like, get them blocked immediately because this is a devotee. And you can tell as soon as you see their username, who they follow, if they've got it on private and they've got like 4,000 people that they follow and like 2 people follow them back. Like, that that's just it's
yeah,
for sexual gain on that. But the fact that you don't get that, honestly, like, because I think it's something I'm so hyper vigilant of. And it's also because I love doing this. I'm like you, like, I love talking about disability. I love talking about like my daily life, all of that kind of stuff. And it's the idea that someone would never take away what I actually had to say from it. I think that almost annoys me even more, because I think being a disabled person, and this stands for men and women, the idea that you're not heard or that you're misunderstood is infuriating, but it's a reality of quite a lot of us. But the idea that someone would purposefully misunderstand you for sexual gain blows my mind.
yeah. I think algorithms have a lot to answer for though as well. Like because like
Yes.
if you go on like Instagram and you're like someone follows you, for example, they're then going to get in the search, they're going to get pictures of other people in
Yeah.
like with limb differences and things like that, or mine's full of different accounts with people in wheelchairs.
Yeah.
So they have it straight there. They don't even have to go looking for it. They can just click and scroll through it and decide who they're going to follow.
Well, yeah, because there's also a lot of hashtags that are very inappropriate, like amp girl, and that's not one that I'm necessarily like, that doesn't bother me, but it's like sexy amputation. That's a problem because
Yeah, yeah, because I keep seeing accounts about like sexy girls in wheelchairs and things like that, and then
yeah,
that's all it is just using people's photos. And it's so wrong. At the end of the day, I get the whole thing of appreciating other people's bodies and people and like and looks, but let's just roll it back a little bit and take the disability out of it again.
uh-huh.
Why should it just be, oh, they're sexy because they're in a wheelchair? They're just a sexy person, full stop. It doesn't matter if they're in a wheelchair, they use crutches, they've got limb difference,
Yeah,
anything. Just yeah.
it is.
We
It's so interesting.
yeah, we I get why it happens, but it shouldn't happen. And I think again, the mainstream media has a place in this.
Yeah,
I I think it's amazing, for example, now that Blue Peter's got a presenter who's in a wheelchair.
yeah.
I will be interested, especially as that is a female presenter, I'll be intrigued to see how they manage on social media with the likes of devotees and things like that.
That's a
Because
really interesting point. And the reason I say this is because someone that I think you know them as well. I'm not going to say their name, but like a very, very prevalent wheelchair user recently put on Instagram, actually on LinkedIn, that she was continually sexually harassed because she was in her wheelchair. Like some of the messages she gets are they're just very, very extreme. So I think you're right. I'll be very intrigued to see what happens and how they handle the social media around that particular presenter, because there is absolutely nothing stopping people messaging her what they message, like our friend. And
yeah,
that will be really interesting to see, because I don't think that topic of conversation, even though it should hit mainstream media, I don't think it will. And I think it
no,
will
and
be
that's
very
what it
much
should
up
it
for
be.
grabs.
Like you said, I wonder at what point they would say, right, this needs to stop
Yeah.
and put something out there and say, right, this is what abuse they're receiving or messages that are inappropriate. Can we please put a stop to it?
Yeah.
I don't see the BBC especially having that conversation. There's a massive safeguarding issue there.
Yes, such a
And
big safeguarding issue.
yeah, it'll be interesting to see how they deal with it.
Yeah, and I completely agree. And I'll be very, very interested to see what happens, particularly surrounding that. There is so many things that are going on in my brain right now that I'm like, what about this? And what about this? And what about this? Honestly, this conversation could go on forever. But one thing that I would like to touch on, and it's an area of expertise that you definitely have, is disability and sex toys. I'm going to like put the two together as a sandwich.
Yes.
Let's talk about it, because something that you said on the last podcast was that quite a number of disabled people don't necessarily reach pleasure without sex toys. And you also were involved in Hot Octopus. So talk to me about disability and sex toys, because I didn't really realize that not all sex toys are accessible.
No, a massive percentage aren't. So as I alluded to in like the last episode, obviously I've been in the industry for a long time.
Yeah.
And it didn't take long to realize a lot of products weren't accessible. Like for me, I would struggle if I was doing a demonstration about certain products. I would struggle with the chargers, I'd struggle with the buttons,
Yeah.
and things like that. So that's when I started focusing on looking for accessible products. And I think this is where companies have a place to play in the market. They don't, and the problem is there is some companies still in the industry who do not see the worth in the purple pound and how big a market it is.
Mm-hmm.
And I've even had a company tell me, oh, we don't want to really market it as a product for the disabled, even though it's an accessible product. They don't want to market it as that because it might affect the rest of their market. So
Okay, there was silence just there, and that's because my mouth is literally wide open. Because that kind of thing, that is ableism in its most finest form.
yeah.
But secondly, you are so right when we think about the purple pound. Now, for those who don't necessarily know what the purple pound is, the purple pound is a spending power that disabled people have. So I think there's a crazy amount of money that disabled people could contribute to companies and shopping and all that kind of stuff. So where you put your money is where you put your purple pound if you are, if you classify yourself as a disabled person. And you're right, there is so much money in the purple pound that companies completely miss out on. But it's amazing that someone said that to you, because had it been any other ism, so
Yep.
that wouldn't have been said. But because it's about disability, it was.
I tried to like have a conversation about how they could really market it like at this disabled market because it's such an accessible product, but they're not interested in doing it because they just worried how it would have an effect. It wouldn't, for me, it wouldn't have any effect. I can't see how they think it would. Hopefully they might change their mind as time goes on, as I have more conversations with them. I don't know. I very much doubt it. But it's not quite often when you see people talking about what's accessible and what isn't, like in the sex toy industry, they'll just always focus on buttons. Oh, it needs bigger buttons, or it needs different buttons. And it's not just about that. They need to start looking at packaging, because some boxes are really hard to get into, so you need to look at things like that. Looking at the instructions, can you download them in an audio file, for example? And even something that I've only learned over the last, I would say, 18 months is for people who are neurodiverse about how the vibration can affect them and the smell and things like that as well.
This is things that you don't necessarily think of straight off the beat, but as soon as someone says it to you, you're like, of course.
Yeah.
It's obvious, but it's also not obvious.
So you can understand why big multi-million-pound companies don't look at these things, because it's probably once you start looking at one, you've got to look at them all. And you're never going to make, I think it's going to be always a struggle to make a completely accessible product, because there's always going to be someone who won't be able to use it for a multitude of reasons. But we just need to have conversation about how we can make products more accessible and look at why they need to be. So, for example, like if someone's in a wheelchair, can they use something they can sit on, for example, more of a humping toy rather than something that's penetrable? If someone's got any issues like with their vulva, does it have to be something that penetrates? Can it just be something more of a clitoral stimulator?
But these are the conversations that we need to be having, because there are so many things that you have just said in like not even like a 2-minute period, and I'm like, boom, 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 boom. So many things have just gone off in my brain, and I'm like, oh my goodness, like I would never have thought of that in 100 million years. But because we've never necessarily had that conversation, and I've never had this conversation with anyone else, where do you go to have these conversations if you need to find out about this information? Like where is this information for people who don't necessarily have penetrative sex, or are not able to, or having like heteronormative sex isn't their thing, but they're still disabled? Where do they go to have these conversations, or listen, or learn about what can be used, what, where, and anywhere?
This is the problem. There isn't a massive amount of that out there. There is Enhance the UK, who do a fab job of talking about sex and disability. But again, it's having people to reach out. I'm happy for anyone ever want to ask a question, just send me an email, drop me a message. I will always answer what I can. Because we need to have these like safe spaces as well. And I often get people saying to me, they will talk to me about sex and disability because I'm disabled myself. They don't want to have them conversations with someone who isn't disabled as well.
Yeah, that was another point that I was going to bring up actually, but I'll bring that up after you've finished. Sorry, I've just completely.
Yeah, and it's the same with sex education. There's such a problem because there's such a lack of male sex educators, especially who go into schools. So this is where we need to change things as well. So because young lads need to learn about respect, consent in a good way instead of watching porn. But a lot of young lads don't feel comfortable having sex education lessons with a female teacher. But there isn't the male teachers who are willing to do it. I have so many, when I've done sessions with talking about sex and disability, and sex toys and things like that, the amount of male people who are there are like, oh, I would never do this if it was someone female talking about it. It's because you're a lad talking about it. They're happy to ask me awkward questions.
Yeah.
But I also don't alienate any females who are there either, because they're happy to talk to me about it as well.
What you just said sparked a memory, and actually thinking about school and sex education, I never had a male sex education teacher. Never. And actually when I think back to like sex education in school, it was just the most awkward experience ever. Like, and generally it is. And I don't really think it's changed much since I was in school. I don't know. It's been quite a while.
Yeah.
Who knows what it's like now, but I can pretty much guarantee that it's probably pretty similar.
Would you have felt awkward if it had been a male teacher?
It depends who it was, I think. It really depends upon who the teacher was. Because I remember at school there were some really good looking guy teachers. I went to a school where there were some really, really, really good looking guys, like male teachers. And I think if it had been any of them, I would have died. I would have died inside. Because I think I probably would have been concentrating more on them than what they were saying. Take it.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's an interesting point. I don't actually know if I necessarily would have been like 100% comfortable with that either, because I think there's something very, very there's something very personal about being taught sex education, and it's not necessarily personal like in the relationships that you have with the teacher, but because it's almost crossing that personal boundary of information. Even though you don't necessarily give out any information, you're kind of being told how your body could work. And I think it's such a weird thing for maybe a girl to be listening to a guy tell you how your body works when they don't necessarily have that experience, because how can they have that experience? They are male and you are female, unless you're trans, and that's a whole other debate that I'm not really willing to get into. But for the sake of this conversation, we're talking about cis men and cis women. And I think there's something, there's a real, almost like there's a loss in translation, because I think if I was to tell you about how your experience as a guy would be, but not have had that experience myself, there would be like a real miscommunication and a real loss of translation there. So I think that's a really interesting point, is that actually, whilst I didn't have any male sex education teachers, would I felt comfortable listening to that conversation? Maybe not.
I think there's definitely a scope for, and definitely reasoning to have mixed classes, but to have a male and a female facilitator.
Yeah.
So you can have them conversations openly. I don't agree with splitting boys and girls up to have sex education. There's maybe the odd thing, maybe, but I don't see, because I think we need to learn. The earlier we learn about each other's bodies, the better. And it breaks taboos down. So, and then if you've got a disabled person in the class, they shouldn't be excluded from that either. It should be said, well, if you've got a physical disability or a learning disability, that may affect your sex life, but let's discuss how you can get around that. Schools need to be more open. There's such a conversation around sex education at the moment. Obviously, with certain MPs wanting to change the narrative, which is shocking. We need to have, it needs to be age appropriate, don't get me wrong, but we need to have more sex education, not less. Because at the end of the day, I would say 99% of children have a mobile phone. They can access anything they want. So why not educate them properly rather than just letting them go and discovering hardcore porn, people like Andrew Tate, all the negativity, toxic masculinity. We need to get rid of that. I find it I talk to a lot of my friends who are my age who have got children anywhere from 5 to late teens.
Yeah.
And they will ask me questions because they don't know how to deal with their own children's sex education. So they'll ask me for advice.
Yeah. Actually, I would happily say that I wish that you had gone into my school to talk about sex education, because I think there are so many things that you learn about that you didn't learn about in school, which you should have learned about like much, much sooner than you did. And I mean like you and we, and I mean it in like the royal terms, as in societally. I don't mean as in like me and you.
Yeah.
But I think you're so right when you say that we need to be starting education, like age appropriate sex education younger, because there are so many things. Like I think about the first time I even knew porn was a thing, and I was young, and I didn't know how to handle that. Like, how does anybody know how to handle that? If that's your first introduction to sex, like, no wonder we have so many issues in society today.
Yeah, and in the last 10 years, porn has got much more hardcore, darker with the storylines.
Yeah.
And it's explaining to people about that. I think there is definitely, like, one of the things in the media regarding sex education conversation is, parents should be allowed to see what their kids are learning. I don't have an issue with that. I think there is definitely a conversation to be had that parents could do with sex education classes themselves, because they are so naive to what is going on around in society. The amount of times I get, like, say, messages from friends and say, "Oh, do you know what this means?" Yeah, it means this. Or because they're afraid of Googling as well, because they don't know what's going to come up. So
who
they'll
knows
just,
what targeted ads are going to come up your way.
yeah, exactly. So they're quite happy. Oh, we'll text them, or he'll know. And that's how it happens. I think there's such a naivety to what access kids have now.
Yeah, I think that's so true, isn't it? Like, we always talk about the benefit of social media, but then it is a beast in itself, and we kind of need to know how to tame the beast, particularly surrounding, younger adults, children, whatever, with that access to social media, that access to the internet. Because actually, when I think about how Apple knows all of my details all the time, like, and how young kids have access to that. And let's be fair, like kids who have grown up fully with the internet, and I'm not just talking about like 90s kids, I'm talking about kids who were born in like 2010,
Yeah.
who will be able to navigate the internet far better than you and I put together, where they can go and what they can get to much quicker with, you know, very, very few steps. What they could find is potentially so damaging that actually, you're right, we need to take a look at that and realize that kids can kind of get what they want to get out of the internet pretty immediately. And
Yeah.
we need to accept that fact and actually put the safeguarding in place so that if people did see that, they know that it's not necessarily real. But I think it's so interesting when we think about disability and how it does impact who we are as people, because you're right, there are some people who really, really embrace it. Like I would say I'm one of those people. I would also say you are one of those people. But then there are other people who really, you know, go against it. And there's almost, and you can see it online, there is a real battle between the people who are like, just accept your disability. Like, it's really hard. It's a journey, but actually once you accept it, like maybe you're in a better place. Like, you know, I can say from personal experience, I'm not actually talking about me, but I'm talking about what other people might say. You know, from personal experience, it's made my life better. There are people who have been on this podcast who have said the same thing, but there's also been people on this podcast who say they might never accept their disability. And neither are right or wrong, but we need to have, like, as you say, this happy medium of actually, you can be disabled and it's okay. Either way you swing, it like, as long as you're happy in yourself, then that's fine, but you don't necessarily need to be assigned to one camp or the other. You can be in the happy medium.
Yeah. And there's people who will openly admit that like their disability has helped them like with their careers and things like that. I definitely one of them. I'm very niche of what I talk about. There's not many people talk about sex and disability. There's not many sex educators who are disabled. I definitely a niche in that respect, and it's benefited me work-wise.
Mm-hmm.
But there's so many conversations to be had. Like going back to the sex education thing, it's even little things talking about, for example, contraception and how someone with a like who has hand dexterity issues or upper limbs missing, they can't put a condom on
Can confirm
potentially.
that is true, not gonna lie, can confirm that is
Yeah.
true.
There is a condom out there that you can do with one hand and you don't need to grip it. But people, I would say 90% of people know about the brand.
I am that target market. I didn't know about it. Like,
So the brand is called Wingman, and it is a condom that has like a plastic holder, and you can literally just pull it straight down the penis. The ring breaks off. That's it. It's on. You can't go wrong with it. You physically can't go wrong with it. I would normally demonstrate one, but I haven't got any at the moment.
this is a shame for everybody, because I think I would have loved to have seen it.
I will film a video of showing one on not on myself, on a dildo. But yeah, it is there.
Oh, that's funny. Yeah, so true, because I never, I always get the other person to do it because I'm like, well, I can't help you in this situation. Like,
Yeah, and it's a conversation I've talked about numerous times, and it's something either we can talk about quickly or in depth for episode 3 if we have to go that far. Is the whole conversation about having children? Because
interesting, very
yeah,
interesting. Yeah, I think you know what, let's talk about it now, because I think this is a very interesting topic of conversation to have, particularly in today's society, but also around disability, that people are almost too afraid to broach.
yeah,
Because we're having this conversation now in society where there are people who are deciding that they don't want to have kids, and that is absolutely fine. But actually, some people are really shocked and taken aback by that decision, that there are people out there who don't want to have kids. Equally, there are people out there who don't want to have kids and are really shocked by the idea of people that want to have kids. Now, throw disability into that, it can become a very, very different conversation. Because I don't think what a lot of people realize is that sometimes disability is genetic, sometimes it's fluke. And there is a big difference, I would say, from personal experience having these conversations with different people, different disabled people with loads of different disabilities. It completely ranges what your disability is and how your feelings of kids are. There is no one size fits all, as there is with people who, you know, want to have kids and don't want to have kids, but with disability, it's a very, very different conversation, because sometimes disability comes with pain, and the idea of inflicting pain on someone that you don't know or that you could bring into this world is not a particularly nice thought or a nice conversation to have.
Yeah, this is a conversation my wife and I had for a long time.
Yeah.
So I think this goes back to sex education. No one told me when I was diagnosed at 14 with EDS that I knew it was genetic, but never really explained the whole thing of, oh, you've got this chance of passing it on and things like that. So the bit I knew at that age was, right, I never want children. I'm not going to pass it on. But then, like, life changes. You meet your partner, and then you start having the conversation. And it's also having that conversation early doors with your partner. They explain that, you know, your condition's genetic, for example. If we have children, there's a high percentage we're going to pass it on. And then if they have any, like, your partner has any conditions, and then you like throwing all that into the mix as well.
Yeah.
It is not an easy conversation. I say it took nearly 20 years for us having that conversation of should we, shouldn't we? And in all that time, you like, using contraception and things, and obviously there's so much debate around female contraception about the damage it can cause and things like that. So you're always having these conversations, and they're not easy ones to have, because I, from like straight away, I would love to have had kids. You know, I'd love to have been a dad. But it was always in the back of my mind, could I cope with the guilt if I passed my ADS on?
Yeah.
Could I cope with the stress of putting all the pressure on Ali to look after a baby? Because I probably physically couldn't like lift them and things like that.
Yeah.
So you're putting more stress on your partner. It's always having them conversations. I think the first 12 months of having a baby would have probably been the easiest, because having a little baby to cuddle, I could have done that, and certain things around the house I'd have been to do. As they're getting old, then explaining to that child that like you're in a wheelchair, you can't do the running around, the playing the football, and yes, there's multitude of things you can do, but it's still a hard conversation, and putting pressure on a child as well. And then also, if we had a baby and anything happened to Ali, how would I cope as a lone parent and things like that? And it was all these conversations going around in your head, and then you can have it one day, right? You think, oh yeah, we've made a decision, we're going to try, and then you think next day, oh, I don't know, something else will come into the back of your head. And I would, I often say it took us 20 years nearly to have that decision, and then we finally made the decision, right? No, we're not going to have children, and yeah.
It's not an easy conversation for anybody to have at all. And I mean, I don't have this experience, so I can't say, but what I can say is I've spoken to enough people who do have that, or that their disability is somewhat genetic. So maybe I've got like third person perspective of that. It's not easy to have that conversation. And particularly, I think what is really interesting with some of it you said is the guilt that you would have if the child that you did have also had the same disability as you, because, you know, the direct lineage is that it comes from your genetics, therefore it comes from you. Or, you know, there's a gene that you and your partner put 2 and 2 together and you get 4, so it's something else. Yeah. And I think that's not something that people necessarily take into consideration when thinking about disability, is that they don't realize that actually at some level, when it comes down to genetics, there is a layer of guilt, because where else did it come from? And I mean like come from in like a very like genetic sense, in terms of, you know, this molecule of DNA does this. I don't even know if it's a molecule of DNA. I don't know what the correct term is, but there is that layer of guilt that's there. And I think that's the same for any parent who had a disabled child who also didn't expect to have a disabled child, because there's also a layer of guilt there. I think guilt will always exist around disability in children and parenthood. I think the three of them actually put a really bizarre sum together, but the equation is something equals guilt. and that is present, I think, for nearly every single disabled parent that I've ever spoken to, is that at some base level, some parents feel guilty because they feel like it was their fault.
Yeah.
And actually, and maybe this is part and parcel to do with society, I'm not sure, but because of how we view disability in the past, it's seen as something to feel guilty for, whereas actually, like, as time has gone on and we do have these platforms where we can speak about this, actually, like, disability is nothing to feel guilty for. But that's a whole societal conversation to have for another
Yeah,
podcast.
I've had people, going years and years back, tell me, oh, you shouldn't have children. You're disabled. You shouldn't have children. You'll pass it on. You definitely shouldn't have. And my thing was always to just ignore them people, because like at the end of the day, I will make my own decision.
It's not, like I said, it's not an easy conversation to have, but there might be someone else out there who listened to this and that helps them in their decision either way. So thank you for being so, like, particularly so vulnerable around this, because it's not an easy topic of conversation to have. And like, I'm
It
really
isn't,
glad that you
and we
had it.
do need to have these conversations. I spoke to someone recently about this. They were struggling making the decision, and I'd reached out to them and said, look, if you ever need to talk, because it is not an easy decision, but society, the way society is, makes it hard to have these conversations, because
Definitely.
you will always have someone who will throw their two pence in.
I'm very much a big believer of your thoughts are your own to deal with. And unless it's something that's really quite damaging. It's like, for example, I recently saw quite a big publication. I think they're worldwide, but particularly in the UK, posted something about how you could be a percentage disabled. So you can be like 87% disabled. And I was like, that's fucking incorrect. But the amount of hate that I got off the back of that for being like, actually, factually, that's incorrect. So you can't be a percentage disabled, just going to put it out there. The amount of hate that I got from non-disabled people was astounding. But the reason I'm saying this is because my thoughts are very much my own thoughts to deal with. But that was something that I couldn't help say because it was wrong. Factually, it was wrong. However, if it's something like hating on someone for being pregnant whilst disabled, factually, there is nothing wrong with that. So therefore, you need to keep those thoughts to yourself.
Yeah, and I don't have an issue with people having their own thoughts on anything. That is, that I will think things that probably people find controversial, I don't agree with, and some things I will put out there depending what it is, as long as it doesn't hurt a specific person or anything like that. I'm not adverse to putting my feelings and thoughts out there. I don't have a filter. I do struggle with that. That is probably because of the area I work in. I don't really have a filter. But at the same time, not. I get easily offended at certain things because I won't say easily offended. I can get offended. But at the same time, that person is entitled to their view. But I just think sometimes they've got to be willing to listen to the other side as well.
Really interesting, because I'm a big believer in that we have lost the art of critical thinking, regardless of who you are. Critical thinking no longer exists. It's either yes, no, black, white, in or out. Whereas actually, if you're listening to this podcast and you don't know what critical thinking is, please go and find out what it is, because as a society we've completely lost the art of critical thinking, and I think it's something that's so key. So I always try to apply critical thinking to like whatever I'm doing. And I think you're so right. Like we've completely lost that need for a debate. And I actually love a debate. If someone can't stand up to me or like can't argue back with me, it's an immediate turn off for me. I'm like, no, not interesting.
Yeah, you've got to be willing to listen, learn, educate, but it'd be a boring world if we all agreed. And
Exactly.
there's always going to be someone that you kind of, I think hate's a strong word, but there's always going to be people you don't like because of their beliefs and things like that. But at the same time, willing to listen. This is my thing with social media. People are quite happy to put a nasty comment and whatever, but they're not willing to debate. They'll throw childish names out and one thing or another. If someone doesn't agree with me, if they want to throw a hurtful comment, talk to me, have a conversation with me and tell me why you think I'm wrong or vice versa. Because you're always going to learn something that's at the end of the day. we have really lost that in society. And I think we've become, as generations go on, I think we have become easily offended. And I think that is another problem. I think we've got to learn sometimes people don't like you. I know people, for example, won't like me because of the way I am. I'm a gobby. I talk about things that some people don't like talking about. They can't weigh me up because they'll see, like, I'll talk about being a straight male and then they see me in bright pink and they're like,
Two plus two does not equal four.
Yeah, I think we just need to learn to talk. I say about learning to love, learning to laugh, and we just, yeah, that's what it's all about. There's so many conversations where we, like I said, we take offense or we won't talk about. And like I said, sex and disability is one of them. You know, people have, they think it's a taboo or they don't think disabled people should be having sex. And there's so many topics in it that we could talk about, and we probably will another day. And like I've talked to someone last week about sex clubs and disability. Like, you know, going to a sex club as a disabled person, what will that be like? And I know people who've done it and do it and have positive and negative depending on the clubs and things like that. And then you get other people saying, well, if you're going to have just a disabled night and just have disabled people, no, because not all disabled people just want to have sex with disabled people. It's like, yeah.
I love that point that you just made, is that not all disabled people want to have sex with disabled people. Surprise!
Yeah.
It's true though. And I think it's not something that people necessarily think about at all, because I think, you know, I've had conversations with people where I've said something and I'm like, oh, but you know, he's not necessarily my type, or, you know, it's not really what I'm into. And then they're like, but you're disabled and so is he. And I'm like, that does not mean that we are compatible. That does not mean that we are gonna be able to hit it off. Like, you know, just because we both fall under this umbrella term of disability does not mean that we automatically are gonna hit it off.
I was going to say, like, did I not realize, like, personality goes a long way? You know, it's not just about.
Yeah, I know, right?
Yeah.
You're missing a limb and I'm missing a limb. Oh my God, we must be the perfect partners. Like, no, that's not how it works.
And you know, when you see like dating nights and they're like aimed at like disabled people, like, but then some people get offended if someone who isn't disabled turns up, and like, obviously this goes back to the devotee conversation because people are worried about devotees. So it's hard. It's so hard as a disabled person, and I dread to think what it is like now dating. I haven't dated for so long, so I can't imagine what it's like in today's society,
10 out of 10.
where it would be like dating and dating apps and things like that. So yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting cross to bear. That's all I'll say. I've met some real weirdos. But that is for another space and another time, I think. I think I'm going to leave this conversation here because there's still so much that we could dive into, and there's so much that I still want to talk about. But I think we've spoken about loads today. We've covered so many topics, and I've loved it. Yet again, I've come away learning something completely new. I've had a completely different way of thinking, which I love. I can only thank you for being on the podcast again. Thank you for coming back. Maybe we'll do a part 3. We'll probably do a part 3 later on this year. I've loved it. Thank you so much for being a guest.
And if anyone has any questions, just drop you a message or me.
Do you know what? Drop Damian the message, and then if you want to drop me a message, I'll pass it on to Damian because he'll know the answer before I do.
But it's been an absolute pleasure.
Oh, thank you so much for coming on, and I'll speak to you very soon.
Thank you.
See you later. Bye.